Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting to you live out of Kingsland, Texas, USA, with episode number 21 of A Rabbi Cross-Examines the New Testament. Tonight we will be discussing Matthew chapter 18 with our beloved Rabbi Michael Skobac, JewsForJudaism.ca. Rabbi, shalom, shalom. I missed you last week.
Oh, boy, did I miss you.
I think we all missed you last week.
But I was in an important place.
That's good. Oh, you know what? Before we even kick off, you got to give us a real quick summary of what it was. Tell everybody and the after party, if you will, how the after party went. I'm curious about that because you told me a little bit, just enough to tease.
Yeah, I mean, it's a long talk, but for the last 28 years, I've been attending the annual conference of the Union of Messianic Jewish Congregations. And basically, we're not there to harass anyone or protest. We park ourselves in the hotel lobby, and we're just available for anyone that wants to speak to us. And so I was there with Rabbi Eli Cohen, came in from Sydney, Australia.
Oh, nice.
And one day, Rabbi Yisrael Chaim Blumenthal drove in from Lakewood, New Jersey for one day. And we were basically pretty much nonstop engaged in pretty deep, meaningful conversations, very, it was non-combative. We were not arguing, but talking about pretty serious issues and deep issues, and really helping people, really develop the possibility of seeking further, getting to know us, getting to see that we're not blind and we're not the Antichrist and we're not ignorant. And it's interesting that the culture changed years ago when we first started going. There was a lot of rancor, a lot of animosity, a lot of hostility, and it's gotten very different now. Everyone wishes us Shabbat Shalom, and
Nice.
It's quite friendly. They even they had a big display of photographs of this conference over the last number of years, and they had a big picture of us.
Oh, how about that? Wow.
From the conference 2 years ago in Woodland Hills, California.
No
So
kidding.
Baruch Hashem, I appreciate the fact that it's a little bit complicated for us to show up at their event. So we try as hard as possible to, not leave a very visible footprint. We're not trying to be in their face, but we're just there for anyone that wants. We don't speak to anyone unless people come and speak to us.
You're just available.
But we're available, and
Nice.
thank God a lot of people spend time with us. And so, the story is, still being written. I've seen some of the kids grow up over the past 28 years. It's been a long haul, but
Nice.
Baruch Hashem, it's been good. So that's why we go back every year.
Well, because
we love them.
So did you sit? Were you and Rabbi Cohen? Were you all sitting in the conference, or were you just made available after?
We're there during the conference, but we just park ourselves in the lobby.
Oh, I gotcha.
We have a room in the hotel.
Mm-hmm.
We have our Shabbat meals in our room. We pray in our room because we're not near any synagogue. But we spend the whole time in the lobby, and the people. Quite a few people sit, with us. We were sitting with some people for 4 or 5 hours.
Nice.
So yeah, and they realize that we're there not because we hate them.
Mm-hmm.
We are there because we love them.
So what was the dominating theme in your mind with all the interactions that you had this week with them? What was the one thing that stood out the most?
Well, there wasn't one theme.
Gotcha.
We spoke about everything from theology to politics to the Bible to their movement and developments in the movement, and people were talking about their personal lives, and we did the same thing. I mean, we were both we were sharing. I mean, it was not
That's
one-way conversation. I mean, again, these are relationships. We've known some of these folks for many years, and so we've developed a real friendship.
That's really nice.
Yeah.
That's nice. Wow. I've got a few of my ex-Messianic friends who have distanced themselves from me, but not to the level that everyone else has, where they pretty much kicked us to the curb and really called us cursed, so to speak. But a few of them actually have been kind of like that. They've been kind of staying in touch, being cordial, except we don't talk about theology, and for actually pretty obvious reasons. But they are trying to be nice, and that's really cool. I respect that highly, especially seeing how many of them really went off the deep end. And just really made us feel less than dirt. You know what I mean? So,
and a number of people there, are genuinely interested in learning about, Jewish ideas and Jewish teachings. Some of them even have been asking us to teach at the conference. So there is a thirst. There is an interest and a thirst to hear about, what traditional ancient Judaism teaches about so many of the issues that concern them. And I think some of them appreciate the fact that they're getting sort of limited perspective, and that, that their teachers may not really be in the same position as we are to, offer a perspective on Jewish teaching that they really are trying to come in touch with. So, anyway, that's awesome. That was what happened last week, and now we're about to dive into Matthew 18.
Yes, we are very excited about that. So, okay, Rabbi, so tell us, you want to do a quick summary of Matthew 17, and then we'll get this baby kicked off. Just kind of anything that you think we might need to for the.
These chapters, they're divided very nicely.
Right.
Okay. 17 was more, I think, controversial. Mm-hmm. This chapter is really not very controversial. It focuses on issues now in chapter 18 about humility, about forgiving others, which are basically mom, pop, and apple pie kind of issues.
Right.
There's no great debate over these issues. We'll see there's some, minor differences, but I think this is a chapter where, reasonable people will read it and say, okay, we're pretty much not exactly there, but we're pretty much there.
Good concepts. I mean, in the very beginning, we told everybody this isn't a bashing the New Testament believers over the head thing. This is really pointing out the negatives and also pointing out the positives. And it turns out there's quite a few of them in this chapter. So,
yeah.
All right. Awesome.
So it begins where, the disciples come to their master, to Jesus, and they want to know who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. It's a strange question, but if you really, I guess people that are really, really spiritual don't usually get too competitive, and who's in first place and who's in second place.
I was thinking about that too. That's a good point.
But they were asking him this, so he says he calls a child to him, a little child. And he, puts them in the middle of the group. And he says, look, I say to you, unless you are converted, I'm sure this is going to be translated differently. I'm reading from the New King James. I'm sure this word converted will be different in different versions. But in my version, unless you're converted and become as this little child or as little children, you'll by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. So, one question that I think came up for me, I suspect that Christian commentaries really weigh in on this, but when they ask him who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, it's not entirely clear, what is this referring to? Meaning, is the kingdom of heaven, the earthly millennial kingdom, that'll be here in this world, but, the kind of kingdom that Jews are looking forward to and that we look to as the Messianic age, and Christians, many Christians look to as the millennial age that will take place in this world when Jesus returns? Or is this some reference to a, transcendent heavenly realm? Is that what it means when it says the kingdom of heaven? So I'm sure there are many theories, but it's not entirely clear from the text itself. And what's interesting is that, and didn't want to get too analytical, but of course, it's obvious that he's being asked here one question, right? They are asking him, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?
Right.
But when you look carefully, he says two things. First of all, he says that without becoming like a child, unless you become like a child, you won't even get into the kingdom of heaven. But then he says, and if you're humble like a child, you'll be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Now, what seems pretty clear is that unless these two things are different, meaning unless there's a difference between simply becoming like a child and becoming humble like a child, unless those two things are different, it's hard to understand what it means then to say you'll be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, because then what would happen is anyone who becomes like a child is automatically the greatest in the kingdom of heaven if being like a child includes, by definition, being humble like a child.
Mm-hmm.
So then it becomes meaningless, meaning they're asking you who was the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus is basically saying that, you're going to get in the first place by being like a child. And then he says, and if you're humble like a child, you'll be the greatest in the kingdom. But then if you have to be like a child, and that includes humility, then everybody who's in there is going to be the greatest, in which case the term the greatest doesn't really mean too much.
It doesn't apply.
Right. I mean, everyone's going to be the greatest, in which case that doesn't mean too much. So there's two ways of resolving this. Number one, it could be that just being like a child may not necessarily, by definition, include being humble like a child. For example, maybe when he says that you have to be like a child in order to even get into the kingdom of heaven, maybe being like a child simply means being innocent, being someone who trusts. Like a child has to have total trust in their parents, right? They can't provide for themselves. So to speak about someone becoming like a child, it's speaking about qualities of innocence, not necessarily naivete, but being an innocent person without guile. The Bible says in Deuteronomy 18:13, it's a very important passage. The Bible says, Tamim tihya im Hashem Elokecha. You shall be whole or wholehearted with the Lord your God. And it's often understood to mean that you have to have sort of an uncomplicated relationship with God. I mean, a lot of people, they want to understand everything. They want to figure everything out. They want to, have everything sort of under control. There are people who spend a lot of time reading the signs and the blood moons and this sign and that sign, because they feel that they need to understand how everything works and when everything is going to happen. And it's pretty clear from the Bible, both in the Christian Bible and the Jewish Bible, that God isn't interested in giving us all the information. You have this idea, especially in the New Testament, that no one knows when the redemption is going to finally come. That's something that only God knows. And a lot of people get very caught up with predicting and figuring out dates and trying to work it out because they don't like the dark, they don't like the gray. So when he says you have to be like a child, it's innocent, it's trusting, it's someone that has no guile, in the sense that they're basically living a very simple life. It's not overly complicated, and they don't need to read all the tea leaves and figure out exactly what things are going to be happening when. That's God's business. But that may not include humility as well. So maybe in the first instance, he says the entrance, the requirement for going to the kingdom of heaven, whether that's terrestrial or extraterrestrial, but it requires being like a child, innocent, trusting, straight, not complicated. And he says, but the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, those will be those who are humble like a child. So that may be a sort of a further development, meaning an extra level that's not necessarily included in the first level. The other possibility is that maybe being like a child automatically includes humility, in which case you can ask the question, well then, is everybody the greatest in the heaven? So maybe what you would say is that there are other ways, meaning that there may be other people who have entrance into the kingdom of heaven. For example, back in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus speaks about you will not be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven unless your righteousness exceeds, surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees. So there he's giving sort of an entrance requirement, right? That unless your righteousness surpasses the scribes and the Pharisees, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. But then he says that those who will be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven are those who keep and teach to observe the least of the commandments. So it's interesting because there the order is a little bit reversed, because there in chapter 5 verse 19 he speaks about what it takes to be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Those are those who keep and teach the least of the commandments. And then in chapter 5 verse 20 he gives sort of the general entrance requirement, which is to have your righteousness and surpass the scribes and the Pharisees. Now it opens up a whole can of worms, because it would seem that if your righteousness surpasses the Pharisees and the scribes, you're already keeping and teaching the least of the commandments, because that's what the Pharisees and scribes would do. So these two chapters here, 18 and 5, they present this little difficulty in terms of who exactly will be getting into the kingdom of heaven. For example, do you have to have both humility of a child and righteousness surpassing the scribes and the Pharisees? Would one or the other do? So it gets a little bit complicated in terms of knowing what are the actual entrance requirements, so to speak, and maybe there are other ones that aren't listed in these two chapters. And then once you're in the kingdom of heaven, what would make you the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So this is, I think, just something that's interesting to think about. I don't think I'm going to solve this riddle tonight. But I will share one observation, which to me is the most significant in this piece that we've just read, which is that when they raise the question here, and this comes up several times in Matthew, right? When Jesus is presented with the question, what are the entrance requirements? What do you have to have in order to, in chapter 19, the next chapter, he'll be asked about having eternal life, right? And Jesus says, keep the commandments. Mm-hmm. Here, it's how do you inherit the kingdom of heaven? And basically, his answer is that you have to refine your personality. Back in chapter 5, the entrance to the kingdom of heaven was to have your righteousness exceed the Pharisees and scribes. But one thing that's missing from all these discussions is that you will not go into the kingdom of heaven, you will not have eternal life, unless you believe that I am God who will suffer for your sins, meaning that you don't get any of the doctrinal bottom line requirements of what I think became later Pauline churchianity. It seems that back here in Matthew, at least, all the discussions about what it takes to, be able to inherit the kingdom of heaven and have eternal life, they're focused on what we would call very Jewish concerns: living righteously, refining your personality, being humble, being righteous. I mean, he would basically be here totally in line with what we would say in Judaism. The one thing that's a little bit of a question mark is when he says that whoever receives one little child like this in my name, what does that mean, to receive children in his name? That's a little bit unclear. And a little bit later tonight, we'll discuss maybe what these kind of statements indicate.
The whole idea of what people tell me all the time, or used to tell me all the time, out of the, when we left the church and went to Messianic Judaism, they said, well, the reason why Jesus never mentioned anything about, believing in me is because he hadn't died yet. I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you think on it on a logical format, let's say I've got, I do have 4 kids. Let's say my 2 oldest ones are still living at home, and they know the general house rules. And let's say me and my wife are fixing to go out of town. Okay, so before we get ready to leave, I'm going to spend, knowing that I'm going to leave, I'm going to spend the next amount of time I can telling them what they need to know after I'm gone, not while I'm there. They already know those rules. So if I leave without giving them any instructions, then I'm a bad parent to begin with. And so the logic of the explanations that I get, it doesn't make any sense. There's no practical usage to that concept altogether. So,
well, it makes sense on some level, but the problem is that it didn't stop John, for example, to very clearly speak about the critical need to believe in Jesus, meaning that it comes up many places in the Gospels. You have it in the 16th chapter of Mark. It says, if you believe in Jesus, you'll go to heaven. If not, you'll perish in hell. So, it's already a concept, which certainly comes up in the Gospels. But here, this is the first, well, not the first one written, but this is the first Gospel that's published. And, there would be no reason, if this was such a central concept, central belief, that here in already 18 chapters, it hasn't come up yet, meaning that we've seen already, this is sort of an ongoing theme so far that we've had in the book of Matthew, that the focus is very clearly on the need to be obedient, the need to observe the commandments, the need to follow the Torah, the need to be righteous, meaning that the entire thrust so far in Matthew has been on basically what Christians call works and deeds and living righteously. And there hasn't really been an equal presentation of the idea that, that all this stuff is very nice, but it won't help you too much, right? Because it's only your faith that matters. So I think, the New Testament is, there's a lot of material. And as I said before, there are often mixed messages. And clearly there will be places which speak about, not just the importance of faith in Jesus, but that's the entire ball of wax. But certainly you're not getting that message so far in the first 18 chapters of Matthew, and I think it's worth thinking about. Again, these would have been perfectly good places for Jesus to put righteousness and following the commandments into perspective, meaning that Jesus could have said, look, it's important to do all these things, but they're not going to get you into heaven. It's ultimately only your faith that will get you into heaven. So I think that, it's not for lack of, the ability for these writers to speak about the importance of believing in Jesus that it's not mentioned here. I think that, it could be that, Matthew already is operating with this principle. It's interesting. I'll just say this as an aside. I've mentioned before the early Jewish Christians, the Ebionites and the Nazarenes, into the 2nd century. So these were basically Torah observant Jews who thought that Jesus was the Messiah. And many of the sources that discuss these groups say that the only book that they had was the book of Matthew. They didn't accept other books of the New Testament, even though they had been around. So you get the sense that it could be Matthew is writing from this perspective, which is, I would say, sort of pre-Pauline, meaning that even though Matthew is written after Paul's writing in the 50s, Matthew's probably being written in the 80s, but still the perspective seems to be one that hasn't yet bought into this idea that works are meaningless. And it's just a theory that I can't prove, and it's something that, again, I'm sure we'll get lots of arguments about. But I'm sharing my perspective,
right?
And I think that it's significant. So just moving on here in verse 6, Jesus now says, and he seems to be speaking again to his inner crowd, to his disciples. And he says, whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me, who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Now, I think in the King James, if I'm not mistaken, the actual King James, I think it says, if you cause one of these little ones to believe in me to sin. I think that the King James gives you the impression that he's speaking to his disciples, and he's saying to his own disciples, if you cause any of the little ones who believe in me to sin, you're in big trouble. I think that other translations, like the New King James here, switches it from you causing to whoever causes, meaning he's speaking here really about anyone in the world. And he's basically saying that anyone who causes those, and here apparently little ones is not little children, but it's almost a term for believers, those who follow Jesus. And I just wanted to suggest that the translation here may be misleading. When we read here of those little ones who believe in me, again, the Christian ears would perk up and think that it means, like a confessing faith in Jesus and believing in Jesus as God, or believing, belief in Jesus, faith in Jesus. And I'm not quite sure he meant that or it really means that. Now, when I consulted different translations, all of them basically had believe in me. The New Living Translation had whoever will trust in me, those who trust in me. It's interesting, when you go back to Genesis 15, right, God says about Abraham that Abraham believed in me, and God credited as righteousness.
Nice.
Now, it doesn't mean that it's saying that Abraham believed that God existed, because obviously this is Genesis 15. Abraham had been talking to God already, going back several chapters. So it's not as if all of a sudden he wakes up and he starts believing in this divine being he'd been speaking to for a long time. What it means there is that Abraham trusted in God, meaning that not that he believed that God existed, but that he had faith in, he trusted in the promises of God. God had just promised him a son, and God promised him, that his children will inherit the land. So what it says is not that Abraham believed in God in the sense that he now is believing in the reality of God, but he is trusting in the promises of God. So I would say that, my opinion, if I can just offer it, is that it's not really talking here about people who believe in Jesus. Or I would say it's not really even speaking about people who trust in Jesus as God, but it's saying, I think, those who follow Jesus. Meaning what he's saying is, whoever causes one of those who follow me, and I would say that in this context of the first century, that's all they were doing. They were basically just, they were following him as the person they thought would be the Messiah. And so if you wanted to stick with the believe in me translation, I would say who believe that I'm the Messiah. I think that when you say believe in me, it sounds more like it's referring to the belief that he is God. I think that's how the Christian ordinarily hears those words. I would hear it differently. So he says that if you cause, basically I'm saying any of my followers, if you cause any of those who follow me to sin, you're in big trouble. He says in verse 7, woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to the man by whom the offense comes. So really he's speaking here about two things, and we have these in the Hebrew scriptures as well. You have in Leviticus 19:14, the Torah tells us, Lifnei iver lo titen michshol, before the blind, don't put a stumbling block. Meaning that, if you do anything that causes someone to sin, you're putting a stumbling block before them. So that's really what he's talking about here, causing someone to sin. So one biblical prohibition would be, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. So for example, if someone has got a problem with drinking, you don't invite them to a party with alcohol, something along those lines. You don't put someone in a position where, it's going to be very difficult for them not to sin. Also in Deuteronomy 13, verse 7 and onwards, there's the passage about those who try to seduce you to idolatry. Again, it's someone causing you to sin. So that's basically what he's speaking about here, that there are all kinds of people who can, Jesus says, cause my followers, those who follow me, to sin, and he's really warning them that you're going to be in big trouble. Don't. And basically he goes into, ultimately the danger of going to hell. Now, in the next little piece here, I guess it's starting with verse 8, he speaks to the individual, not about tempting others to sin, but people with their own sin problems. And he says, if your hand or foot causes you to sin, you should cut it off and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life. I guess it means going into the world to come, or into the kingdom of God, lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet, than to be cast into everlasting fire. So he says, if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life with 1 eye rather than having 2 eyes and be cast into the hellfire. It's similar to what we saw back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 29, where Jesus says you should pluck out the eye that tempts you. Now, almost all Christian commentaries understand this is not to be taken literally. I think that no one really takes it literally, that if you have a problem that's caused by one of the parts of your body, that you should maim yourself. Although some historians say that Origen, the church father Origen, castrated himself to fulfill what we'll see, I think in chapter 19, verse 12, about becoming a eunuch for the sake of heaven, and also that he might have been tempted sexually, and so if that's tempting him, just get rid of it. So he may have taken these passages literally because he actually did it, or at least according to historians who believe that he did it. It's disputed, and some historians say that he never did it. But it's very clear that the Torah, our Hebrew scriptures, are very strong, and they prohibit any maiming of ourselves. For example, if someone is mourning and they're bereaved in grief over the loss of a relative, you were not allowed to pull the hair out of your head. Maiming yourself, we even know disfiguring yourself with tattoos was biblically forbidden. So this could never be understood literally, according to the Hebrew scriptures. But I think, for our discussion, what comes out, though, even if you take it non-literally, is that the sentiment here, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think the sentiment here goes against grain or the thrust of the Hebrew scriptures. Meaning, the Torah seems to assume, I believe, that we can always overcome temptation, and we can always change, and we can always improve. And the Torah never seems to throw in the towel and say, you know what, it's going to get so bad that you're going to have to basically pluck out your eyes. I think the Torah doesn't ever give such a gloomy message that it's going to have to go that far. The Torah seems to be quite confident that human beings have the ability to overcome temptation. You actually see it right in the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis 7:4, where God says to Cain, I think is it 7:4 or 4:7? I forget. God says to Cain that sin will always lie at your door. Sin will always tempt you. But God says to him, but you can rule over it. God is constantly telling us we have the ability to rule over temptation, to rule over sin. Not that sin will not be difficult to overcome.
4:7.
It's 4:7. Mm-hmm. So that's a theme which you really see throughout the Bible, that if we didn't have the ability to rule over sin and temptation, then God would not give us all of these instructions which he expects us to follow. So God basically, the message seems to be in the Hebrew Bible that I know that you can be good. I'm going to give you instructions that I expect you to follow because I know that you can follow them. And I'm going to hold you responsible if you don't follow them properly. That seems to be the consistent message of the Hebrew Bible, whereas the message here seems to be, and it obviously gets much worse in the writings of Paul. I mean, Paul, tells you that it's just totally impossible to be good. But here it seems to be saying that the temptation can be so great that, that sort of allegorically or symbolically, you may have to even pluck out your eye, etc. I think it's just sending a different kind of message than the Tanakh sends. I may be overstating that case, but let's move on to verse 10. So this is the parable of the lost sheep, it's called in some Bibles. And so Jesus, again, it's very strange why he would be saying this to his own followers, right? He says, take heed you do not despise one of these little ones. Meaning it seems that he's not talking here about 4-year-olds, but he's speaking about despising those who follow him. Because I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven, for the Son of Man has come to save that which is lost, that which was lost. And he gives this parable where obviously the Father is so concerned about, making sure that not even one sheep out of 100 goes astray. So the message of this parable is, so it's your will of your Father in heaven that not one of the little ones, not one of the believers should perish, should be lost. So again, when I read this passage, I just wasn't entirely clear why Jesus had to be giving this message to his own followers, meaning why would those who are his disciples, those who are his followers, why would they despise other followers? Why would they lead other followers astray? Why would they, cause other followers to be lost? So I think what I came to understand was that Jesus here may be anticipating the future when there would be great strife and acrimony between his followers, even though he's constantly encouraging his followers to love each other. But we know what happened in church history. We know that Christians turned on each other. They went to war and killed each other over, relatively minor issues of doctrine. So here, one way I would think maybe we can understand this is that he's not speaking to his immediate listeners. He's not speaking to, Peter and John and James, and he's suspecting that they're going to cause some other believer to stop believing or stop following Jesus. But I think maybe he's looking toward the future and saying, look, when this movement continues down the line, I want you to not despise each other. I want you not to cause others to get lost. And maybe one other way of reading it is that maybe he's saying that, not everyone who says they're a believer in me, not everyone who says that they follow me is a real follower. We saw back in Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, he says that not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, meaning that there are many people, he seems to be saying, who claim to be followers of Jesus, who claim to be Christians, who claim to believe in Jesus, and they're not going to get into the kingdom of heaven because basically he's telling them, you're not really my followers. So maybe that's how this can be understood. He's speaking here to false believers, to people who, maybe just, superficially claim to follow him, but deep down inside they don't. And maybe those are the kind of people that would despise other believers. But I find it a difficult passage. Mm-hmm. You ready to move on, or do you want to recapitulate some of this?
It's so thick and meaty. There's so many different things, and I've heard so many different perspectives on a lot of these. But the way you described this last one, I think, is probably the one that resonated the most in my understanding of it as well. Let's just go ahead, because this is one of those things that we could probably spend 2 or 3 episodes just on this one chapter.
We want to cover some ground.
Yes.
So the next piece deals with how do you deal with a sinning brother, and it begins in verse 15 that if any of your brother sins against you, so you should go tell him, right? You go to him and tell him his fault between you and him alone. Now, this is something from the Hebrew Scriptures in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 17. There's a very, very important teaching which says, "Hocheach tochiach et amitecha." You have to surely reprove your your friend, your neighbor. Meaning that if someone that you have a relationship with that you know is doing the wrong thing, you don't go behind their back and talk about them to others. You have to go to them and tell them, you know what, brother, you're doing the wrong thing. What you're doing is not right. And it's interesting that the verse there says not just to give them reproof, but it says velo tisa alav chet, and don't bear sin because of them. And it really means two things. Number one, if you don't correct them, if you don't reprove them, then you bear some responsibility for their continuing to do the wrong thing, because we're responsible for each other. We're one family, and we just can't, as the parable in the Talmud goes, if you're on a boat with a whole bunch of people and one of them starts drilling a hole under their seat, right? They just can't say, leave me alone, it's my seat. And they're going to sink the whole boat. So we have a responsibility one toward the other. And so when it says you have to surely correct your friend, your colleague, your neighbor, and it says, and don't bear sin because of him, because if you don't correct him, you bear some responsibility. But the other piece is that it's telling you that when you do correct someone, when you do reprove someone, don't do it in a way in which you will be sinning, meaning don't embarrass them. Don't correct them in public. Don't do it in a heavy-handed way where you make them feel like 2 cents. Don't go overboard in your reproving of them. Do it in a way which is sensitive and which will be effective, and don't yourself do it in a way which is sinful, let's say with animosity or with a feeling of arrogance or superiority, that you are lording this over someone. So that's what Jesus seems to be saying here. And again, that's exactly what people should be doing. Now, it's interesting that he says that, if going to this person is not going to be effective, then you have to take 1 or 2 people with you, and you do it again. And if he refuses to hear them, then you have to go to the whole, congregation. And ultimately, if the person refuses to bend to the will of the congregation, of the community, then he says in verse 17, then let him be like a heathen or a tax collector, like a Gentile or a tax collector, which basically is saying that if this person refuses to bend or follow the direction of the community itself, it's not just between you and them, but the whole community is saying, look, you have to really get your act together. If he refuses to do that, then he says that they're treated like a Gentile. They're treated like a tax collector, which means basically they're not treated anymore like someone in the community. They're basically seen as an outsider. Now, I don't know what the ramifications are, meaning is the scripture here, the New Testament, telling us that you have different responsibilities towards fellow believers than towards non-believers, meaning do you have to only be nice, for example, to fellow believers? Do you have to treat them in some special way, but the Gentiles and the tax collectors, you don't have to be so nice to them or so good to them? So he's sort of hinting here that there are different relationships we have. We relate in one way to fellow believers, to people that are part of the believing community, but those that are outside the community, apparently you don't treat them in the same way. And it doesn't really spell out here what that difference is. And in the last verse, I think it's significant because Jesus says that I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth concerning anything that is asked, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Now, it seems at least on the surface that Jesus here is distinguishing himself from God, because he's saying that God is the one that answers prayer. However, he does seem to put himself in the position of some kind of intermediary. So here you have, I think we've discussed this already a number of times, that the question of how does Matthew see Jesus in terms of Jesus's identity? Is Jesus presented clearly as God in the flesh? Is Jesus presented simply as a regular human being? Is Jesus seen as an elevated kind of human being, or maybe some kind of angel, some kind of intermediary? I think one thing that I've said before is that you don't get a real clear message. You get a lot of mixed messages. Here, it seems to be saying in verse 19 that, basically the one that's in control is our Father in heaven. But in verse 20, he seems to put himself in some position of being a mediator. Mm-hmm. And that, again, from a Jewish biblical perspective, is a huge problem, because in the Jewish biblical perspective, we go directly to God. God says in Psalm 145, verse 18, God is close to all who call upon him. And it never says God is close to those who call upon, some intermediary to get to me. So this idea of needing an intermediary to get to God is just problematic. But I think that's maybe as far as Matthew is going here. We'll wrap up, I think, with this last piece, which is about the unforgiving servant. And there are the two parts. First, Peter, in verse 21, comes to Jesus and says, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Do I have to do it up to 7 times? Now, it's not really clear to me. I may be just thick here, but it's not really clear to me what Peter is describing. I think there are 2 ways of looking at it. Is Peter talking about a case where someone sins against you, and then they immediately ask forgiveness, but they then sin again, and you forgive them, and they repeat this sequence 7 times, meaning it could be talking about someone who keeps on sinning against you, right? And he does it 7 times, and 7 times he's asked forgiveness, and maybe after the 7th time already, you don't take him seriously, meaning that if he really was sincere about asking for forgiveness, he wouldn't keep on doing it. So maybe Peter is saying, you know what? If he gets to the point where he sins 7 times and asks forgiveness 7 times, that's the limit. And the 8th time, I just blow him off, because his asking forgiveness, his apology, is just meaningless. Is that what he's describing here? Or is it someone who has sinned against him 7 times and never asked for forgiveness, and after the 7th time comes and seeks forgiveness? So that's another way of looking at it, meaning he says, how often shall my brother sin against me and I forgive him? Meaning Peter is asking here, meaning if he even sins 7 times in a row, do I have to forgive him? Now Peter seems to be assuming then that if the person sins 20 times in a row, then of course you don't need to forgive him. But he's saying, what if it's only 7 times? So the person, he every single day of the week he does something terrible to me, and then at the beginning of the next week he comes and says, I feel terrible about what I did last week. So he's saying, do you have to forgive him? And it's not clear to me what case Peter is really describing. And Jesus says, no, it's not 7 times. It's 7 times 70 times, which basically, that would be 490 times. It seems to be a way of saying it's unlimited, meaning he seems to be saying regardless of how often someone sins against you, you have to always forgive them. The Torah speaks about this in a slightly different context. The Torah doesn't speak about so much the responsibility of the wronged party, but the responsibility of the person that did wrong. Meaning the Torah says that if you hurt someone, then you have to apologize. And if they don't forgive you, you have to go back. And if they don't forgive you, you go back again. And you have to do that 3 times. Meaning if the person that was hurt will not forgive you, you've got to go back 3 times. Once you've apologized 3 times and they still refuse to forgive you, then it's their problem. You've already fulfilled your obligation. So the Talmud, this is in Tractate Yuma, 86b to 87a, deals with this question of how many times the person that's been in the wrong, how often do you need to go back and apologize to someone who won't forgive you? The New Testament here seems to be focusing not on the bad guy, but on the victim. And it says, you know what? Peter is assuming that there's sort of a limited number of times that you have to be offended, and then once you've been wronged 7 times by someone, you just ignore them. And Jesus seems to be saying, no, even if they sin against you 490 times, you still need to forgive them. Now, this comes up. We actually had this recently, in the United States. This came up a couple of weeks ago with those church shootings where that, really evil person, hateful person went to a church and murdered 7 of the people in the Bible study. And interestingly, the relatives and the friends, I think, just forgave this person. And this comes up a lot. I remember years ago when I think this fellow from, I think it was Bulgaria, shot the Pope. This is many, many years ago. He was in jail and the Pope went to forgive him. So I think there's a question, at least that I would have and Judaism would have, about what we would call unilateral forgiveness, meaning that does it make any sense to forgive someone who is not remorseful and who has not apologized? So it seems that the Pope was going to forgive this person regardless, and it seems that this shooter, in the church, he wasn't remorseful. He didn't apologize. He didn't feel bad, and yet, there was this impulse to forgive him anyway. I think it's considered to be a Christian virtue, in the sense that what you're saying is, I will not seek revenge. I'm not going to seek revenge. I'm going to forgive. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that it's not just revenge. Revenge is not the only thing that people should be interested in. I think the revenge is not a healthy impulse, but to seek justice, to seek at least that the person has some remorse, I think is legitimate. Mm-hmm. Because I think what happens is when we simply forgive people without their remorse and without their seeking forgiveness, it really becomes sort of a perversion of what life should be like. It almost encourages people to do the wrong thing because we're not doing anything to discourage evil behavior. You can get so we can refuse so much to not want to judge other people. Mm-hmm. We shouldn't be judging people. The truth is that we don't really know what's going on in someone's head. So judging people is not really right, but there has to be accountability. We have to not give up on the importance of accountability. And so what the Torah seems to emphasize is that there are 2 people that have responsibilities here. The person that's in the wrong has a responsibility to be remorseful and apologize and seek forgiveness. The people that have been wronged, they really have a responsibility at that point not to be stubborn and not to be cruel, and to forgive and to accept the apology, especially when the person has made some effort to make amends. Now, in a murder, you really can't make amends. But there are ways of showing your sincerity. There are ways of showing your true remorse. And I just think, it strikes me at least, and I'm sure it strikes people who've been sort of, affected and saturated with the values of the Hebrew Scriptures, that unilateral forgiveness may not really be healthy, for anyone. I think it begins to overlook other factors, other issues which are important.
I think Luke actually touched on that on 17:4. It says, if your brother sins against you, this is kind of the 70 times 7 reworded by Luke. And it says, if your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, then forgive him. Of course, I put the word then in there, but I think he's got a better understanding of maybe what Matthew was trying to say. I'm not sure. But he goes.
It's interesting. The question would be, is Luke disagreeing with Matthew's presentation, or is it sort of helping understand what Matthew's saying better? I'm not sure. It seems just from a simple reading of Matthew, there's no expectation that the the person is going to apologize. Now, you could say, I think that you can argue and say, based upon the earlier passage in this chapter in Matthew, where he says that you go to someone, and if they've done the wrong thing, you confront them and you tell them that they hurt you, and they're supposed to apologize, and they're supposed to make things right. And if they don't, you take 2 or 3 people with you, and if they don't, you go before the whole church. And if still refuses to respond, then they can be sort of disbarred from the congregation. They can be rejected. But it's not really, at least from Matthew itself, not clear that the person has to ask forgiveness before they're forgiven. And, it seems that many Christians have taken this at face value, and there's sort of this what's considered to be a Christian virtue in just unilateral forgiveness, whether or not the person has expressed remorse or apologized. So, Luke may be more in line with, I guess, the values of the Hebrew Scriptures, and I'd say it's an open question as to whether or not Luke and Matthew really agree on this. But I think, as we say in France, that's all she wrote for tonight.
That is a wrap. My goodness. Okay. It's a juicy one. So next week we'll be here, same time, same place. And and so I guess I should drop the teaser at least, right? Well, we already dropped one teaser on something we haven't cashed in on yet, and that is the Jewish history, like the Crash Course 101 that you're going to be doing at some point. We haven't actually discussed a date on that, but what we have discussed a date on, and I have actually commented on Facebook, so people are expecting it at some point, is the Torah Portion Tuesdays. And so Rabbi Skobac has agreed to jump in that, how do you say, the jump rope, and hit on his cycles
in the rotation.
In the rotation. So for all you Michael Skobac fans out there, you'll be seeing him on Tuesdays once every 8 weeks once we get this kicked off. So we'll do it.
I'm looking forward to that. That sounds great.
I am too. Rabbi, my journey actually that led me out of Messianic, the Messianic movement, had a lot to. I'm thinking that for about a year before I fully came out of Messianic Judaism, I started studying Torah more, and I went and downloaded literally every single Torah portion download you could possibly download from Chabad.org. I mean, it was like I would listen to like 18 to 20 hours of lectures every week on that week's Torah portion, hearing these different voices telling you their perspectives, and I just stayed fully immersed in Torah. And what made me think about this was when I was searching for Torah portions, because I was so hungry for what does Judaism teach about Torah? That's what I want to know. And I can only find 1 or 2 places. And Chabad.org was a great resource, and I've still got them on my phone. I listen to them still. But I'm thinking I would like to have this Tanakh Talk as a platform for offering that to others, also as an alternative. And so. And again, Rabbi, thank you for agreeing to jump on, and for all you fans out there, just keep tuned in. We will pinpoint a date here soon. I suspect it will get kicked off sometime within the next 6 weeks. I'm thinking we'll get the very first pilot up and running. So
wonderful!
I'm excited about it. I can't wait. And so, get back over here. It's funny. I grunt a lot these days, and I don't need to. It's just I don't know. It's habit. I bend over to tie my shoe. I'm like,
getting old, William. Getting old.
I am. I used to think that nowadays I have to take off my glasses to read up close, and I rationalized it at first. I was like, hey, look, my eyes are getting better. I don't need my glasses to see up close anymore. Oh man, that's funny. So when I grunt to bend over to tie my shoes, it's because I'm using more muscles I never had before. Okay. All right. Well, Rabbi, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for tuning in. Be sure to share this video on your wall for others to tune in, listen, and who might have a need for this. Also, you can subscribe to Rabbi Michael Skobac's website. If you want to jump on the support bandwagon, you can. There's probably a support click icon there somewhere. You can pretty much find those on anybody's website. And meanwhile, check him out on YouTube, follow him along. And until next week, I guess we'll see you then. Thank you, Rabbi.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom, shalom to you too, sir. There it is. Fantastic. See you, people. Love you.